John, you talk about customer-funded business, right? So, and you kind of veer in this book, you veer us away from the VC model or angel venture capitalists. Is there anything, is there downside of that angel capital or VC capital? Why do you kind of veer us through this way?
Yeah, there's some significant downsides to raising capital, especially when it's raised early. The biggest one is that it's a huge distraction. So anybody who's raised capital for a new venture knows that what we have is a very full-time process. If you're going to go out and raise money, that's pretty much all you're going to do for months at a time, sometimes more than a year. Well, if that's how you're spending your time, then the question I would ask is, well, how are you not spending your time? Well, you're not spending it trying to fine-tune your offering so that it's exactly right for the customer. You're not spending it so that you can understand the customer, what their needs are. You're not spending it on putting together the other resources that you need beside money. So the biggest downside of raising capital early, whether it's venture capital, angel capital, or whatever, is the huge distraction. But beyond that, if you do raise capital, what happens is you make this pitch, and maybe you get some angels to back you, and what do they expect you to be able to do? Well, they want you to flawlessly execute the plan that's in your pitch. Well, one of the things that Randy Commissar and I learned in developing the research that underlies my second book, Getting to Plan B, is that Plan A almost all the time doesn't work. Well, then why would you want to go flawlessly execute Plan A if it's Plan B or Plan C or who knows, Plan Z that's really going to work? So there's a fundamental mismatch there. You end up in a straitjacket often with an investor who wants you to execute Plan B. Further, and it gets worse than that, when you raise money really early, your venture's risky, of course, right? We all know what the failure rate is, and the investors know it too. So they require a pretty substantial stake in the firm if they're going to give you money really early. Well, that's typically not what the entrepreneur had in mind, giving away a bunch of the business before it even starts. And then, of course, along with that check comes two other things. You get a shareholders agreement. And I suspect many of us on this call have a case or a session in our course where we teach about shareholders agreements. But one of the things I tell entrepreneurs is I guarantee you one thing: you will not like the shareholders agreement. It puts all the power in the hands of the investor. So all of these things happen, and they're all kind of bad, right? Much better if you can get customers to fund you.
Absolutely. So when you're trying to satisfy all those investors, you are not satisfying your major people who are most important, which is the customers, right? You start the business because of that. So you did thorough research, and you talked about there's different ways of accepting funding or receiving funding from customers. Can you walk us through some of the major ones, John?
Yeah, so it turns out that there are actually 5 ways you can do this. So way number 1 is what I call a pay in advance model. You simply get the customer to pay you before you give them what they're buying or selling. Now, that's what Michael Dell did when he started Dell, right? He was providing personal computers for small businesses, and you had to pay for the computer before you got the computer. And with the cash Michael got for the computer he was about to put together, he'd buy the parts, pay somebody to assemble it, and off he'd go. Virtually every service business is pay in advance, at least in part. If you're going to remodel your kitchen, you're going to pay the designer or the architect something in advance before they start work. So pay in advance it's nothing new. It's very well established, but it's a fantastic way to get a business started. So that's number 1. The second one is what I call matchmaker models, and that's Airbnb and eBay and all these companies. Uber doesn't have any taxi cabs. Airbnb doesn't have any hotels. You know, eBay doesn't have any inventory. None of the matchmakers ever touch what they buy or sell.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, they need very little capital to start, and almost all of those kind of businesses can get started
Mm-hmm.
with no money from investors, but relying on fees or commissions from their customers. So that's the second. Pay in advance, matchmaker, those are the first two. The third
Mm-hmm.
one is subscription models. So we all subscribe to stuff, right? We subscribe to Netflix, we subscribe to periodicals, the Wall Street Journal, whatever. When do we pay for those? Well, again, we pay for them up front before the subscription is delivered. Again, you can do that with your customers' cash. A fourth one is what I call a scarcity model, and it's what Zara does.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us, I think, on this conference know about Zara, and many of us are probably Zara consumers. And Zara has invented this ingenious model that they call fast fashion,
Mm-hmm.
where they get the latest fashions to the store in very quick time, and they do that in scarce quantities. So the customer, the Zara customer, the fashionista customer, has been trained that if they see something in the store that they like, they better buy it because tomorrow it's going to be gone. So Zara turns their inventory 12 times a year. That's way faster than Gap, where I used to work.
Mm-hmm.
We turned our inventory 4 times a year. Well, because Zara's turning that inventory 12 times, it's only got 30 days in investment in the inventory, and it pays its suppliers in 60 days. So it's got 30 days worth of the customer's money with which to pay the suppliers and do all the other things it needs to do to grow the business, like open new stores. Fantastic. Scarcity, making it scarce in both time and in quantity. And then the fifth model is what Bill Gates and Paul Allen did. In the early days of Microsoft, they were writing custom operating systems, as many of you know, for all the early PC makers, virtually all of them. Well, after they wrote a bunch of those, they said, you know, these are all kind of looking about the same, right? So they said, why don't we just write one operating system? We'll call it MS-DOS, and we'll let it be in a shrink wrap box or be able to download it with, you know, digitally to the computer. And that's when the value of Microsoft really took off. So they converted what had been a service business, right?
Mm-hmm.
Writing customized operating systems, to a product business, just shipping copies of MS-DOS. And of course, the rest of the story we all know. So 5 ways to do it. None of them are rocket science. None of them are brand new. But we in our entrepreneurship classes don't talk about these things because we're so damn busy talking about making a pitch deck and finding an angel and raising some capital. I think we're really missing a trick.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. And for, well, those really great examples, but also those 5 different models that's really insightful. And I've been typing those to all the attendees in the chat function. Pay in advance, matchmaker, this is my student teacher version coming here summarizing. Pay in advance version, matchmaker, subscription, scarcity model, and custom to standardize model. So at this moment, I would like to ask you some questions that's from the audience, that's been raised from the audience, and we have really good interaction from the audience. So one of the first question I want to ask you is the question that's been asked in the Q&A session and in the Q&A function. And that's from, I'm going to butcher this name, Vitality Skordizivea. Sorry about that. But she asked a really great question. So all these 5 models are really great, but can you talk a little bit about the connection between those theoretically and maybe give one example of what happens practically?
Yeah, so what happens practically, let's take pay in advance, for example. Let's say you're building something that's going to serve a B2B clientele. It might be some enterprise software, it might be a physical product, who knows? Mm-hmm. So you think you have an idea that's going to solve some customer's problem in the B2B arena. Well, you go to that customer and you say, you talk with them, you try and understand their problems and say, well, I've got a possible solution here. Might this work for you? And you know, at that point, you've built a very modest prototype, perhaps, or a mock-up of what the system is or something. And if you're solving a compelling problem for that B2B customer, that customer will want to tear your shirt off to get your solution. And you're then in a position to say, okay, well, I've got this prototype this far. I need a check for X, $10,000, $50,000, whatever it is, to get it to the point where I can deliver it to you. Now, a couple of good things happen when you go through that process. Number one, if the customer really has a compelling problem and they think your solution is going to solve their problem, you're in a great space, okay? Because you've now got your first customer. If, on the other hand, they are reluctant to pay you to do that, that's some really important information for you, because maybe the problem you thought they had is not a compelling problem, or maybe your solution to their problem isn't the right problem. Well, it's really helpful to get that feedback early so you can pivot. But all too often, you know, we go blindly down a path as entrepreneurs and say, you know, the world will beat a path to my door. If I just build it, they will come. And this process of trying to get customers to fund you short circuits that problem and forces the customer to tell us, you know, with their feet and with their checkbook, you know, are we really onto the right path? So that's one example.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, John. So there's other comments. I would like to move on to the second comment. Actually, is not a question, but I want to see your response. This is an interesting comment from Joran Solomon. And he mentioned when you're in your first way of pay in advance model, it doesn't have to be pay in advance. Just having longer payment terms extended to you by your suppliers than the payment terms extended to your customers. The same, it will apply if you allow your customers to pay in 60 days, but your supplier give you 3 months, 90 days to pay them. Is that is that a good understanding, John?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the basic idea is you want to get money from your customers before you have to give it to your suppliers. And that could be in advance, or it could be very good terms. But those terms are, you know, even though they aren't advanced terms, but they're better than what your supplier terms are. So he's exactly right.
Absolutely. So thank you, Raram. Moving on to the next, I saw several good comments from Mujtaba Asham here at San Diego State, and from someone else mentioned as well. So one thing that is really gaining popularity is crowd-funded model from Kickstarter, from Indiegogo. So how does this 5 model that you relate to, customer-funded, relate to that model?
It's a really interesting question. When I was doing the research for the book, and I talked to people to better understand the phenomenon, they say, "Oh, you're going to write a book on crowdfunding," and because that was back in the relatively early days of crowdfunding, and I said, well, crowdfunding is an example. It's a subset, if you will, of a customer-funded business, because when you crowdfund, you are getting paid in advance. You get some money, and then you promise to deliver the product, whether it's a fabulous cooler, one of the big hits early on, or something else. But you know, there's some downsides to crowdfunding as well. It's a good thing, and it's a way to get some cash, and it's a way potentially to get customer feedback on whether you're on the right track. But there are a couple downsides. One of them is that these days, in order to compete in that very overcrowded world of crowdfunding, you've got to have a really compelling video. You've got to have a prototype built, most likely. And all those things cost time and money, right? And the other thing that many people don't understand about crowdfunding is that you have to bring your own crowd. So the way it really works, as many people in this conference probably know, is you get your uncle and your cousin and your sister, you know, to make early commitments on the crowdfunding when you launch, and gradually you build up momentum, and eventually you hope that the crowd will follow. Well, all of that's a ton of work. And And yes, it's fine to do that, but sometimes I wonder, would that time and money preparing all that stuff be better spent if you focused on the customer group that you really think you want to eventually reach and get them, to give you feedback, to help you clarify exactly what the product should be, and perhaps pay you in advance for that product.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, John. Again, let's move on to the next question that I saw a theme coming up here. Also is corresponds to the question that we talked a little bit before, which is the questions that from Yan Li. It's great. This is great to remind us that VC is not the only model, which you did really well, John. It would be helpful if you could also talk about under what conditions would customer-funded model be more useful, and what conditions would a VC model be more useful?
So that's a really good question. These days in VC, and even to some extent in angel investing, increasingly the investors want to see customer traction. Mm-hmm. Okay, they don't want to take as much risk as they used to take, and so what I find is that getting customer traction and getting customers to pay you in advance is a really good road to eventually raising VC. And the nice thing about it is it's a way to raise capital, the VC capital, on much better terms. So let's take Airbnb as an example. Airbnb, as many of you know, started with a couple of design students in San Francisco who are having trouble paying the rent. And there was a big design conference coming to town that was oversold. There weren't enough hotel rooms, and they said, well, let's reach out to the bloggers and we'll let some people sleep on our floor and we'll feed them breakfast. They bought a couple air mattresses, hence the name Airbnb. Well, they focused on only conference goers and only in San Francisco for the first several months of building that business. And the only revenue they had was people sleeping on originally their floor and then later on their friends' floors and other people's floors or couches or spare bedrooms or whatever. Well, when that customer traction got put in place and then they went to the Democratic National Convention in Denver in 2008 and got some much bigger traction, the VCs noticed. They were then accepted into Y Combinator, got a little money there, and then the rest of is the history we know today. So the point is that if you get customers to pay you first, that will lead you to raising capital to grow rather than capital to start. And because you're raising it to grow and you've already proven customer traction, you'll have a queue of VCs outside your door that want to fund you. That's very different than trying to sell a pitch early on. Mm-hmm. So the direct answer to the question is, if you can do it with customer funding at the beginning, you always should do that. Now the question then becomes, okay, when should I maybe switch to venture capital, or should I never switch to venture capital? And that's a choice the entrepreneur can make, depending on whether they think they're in a foot race with other people who are going to be well-funded, mm-hmm. or whether they think they've got something that they can protect that can go on forever. And of the stories in the book, some of them are companies that reached $100 million valuations without ever raising a single dollar of venture capital. Mm-hmm. So I think the real question isn't whether you should start with customer funding. You should start with customer funding if you possibly can. The question then becomes, okay, once I've got traction, do I then raise capital, or do I keep doing it with my customers' money? And that's a question that the entrepreneur has to answer, depending on the competitive context they're in, the degree that their new thing is defensible, and the speed they want to go, and whether they want to have meddlers in the game. VCs add value sometimes, but sometimes they don't.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, John. Thank you, John. I just want to mention that in the chat function that in addition to what the reasons that John talked about, there's also regulation with SEC here in the United States about regulation about crowdfunding that the Yaram Solomon has shared with our session, so you guys can check that out. So thank you for doing that, for sharing that insight. So let's kind of move on to a little bit of the next area. So John, once we hear about your 5 models, it makes sense. It immediately makes sense to us that we see angel investor is not the only road, right? There is the 5 models, customer funded, is much a better road oftentimes. But what could we do as entrepreneurial educators to communicate this message in class? And what could we do in our teaching, in our education to tell students about this?
It's a great question, Song Song. So I taught, or have taught over the last 15 years or so at London Business School, most of my teaching in 2 different courses. One of them is a course on assessing opportunities, where we use the framework in my first book, The New Business Road Test, to ask students to objectively assess, gathering real evidence, how attractive their opportunity is. And in the context of that course, we ask them to think about customer-funded principles and figure out along the way which of those customer-funded models would make most sense for whatever it is that the students are trying to do. So for one student team, it might be a matchmaker model. Another one might need to start as a service business and then transition to a product business. So different ways for different kinds of things. The major part of my teaching, though, interestingly, has been in the entrepreneurial finance course. So I teach people about venture capital and due diligence and making deals work and valuation and all that good stuff. Well, when I wrote the customer-funded business, I said, we've got to have a session in the entrepreneurial finance course that focuses explicitly on customer funding, because it's another and often a better source of finance. So I have a case that I have a few cases, but the one I most often teach is called budgetplaces.com. You can find it on the casecenter.org case clearinghouse in the UK. And I use that case in the entrepreneurial finance course to teach about these 5 customer-funded models. So I think what we have to do is we have to get our students to understand that yes, VC is one option, but it's not your first port of call. So how do we help you understand, these customer-funded models? Well, we put a session in an entrepreneurial finance course. We put a session in a business plan course. If you're a case teacher, if you're a PowerPoint teacher, whatever, you can do that. But we really should be having a session in those kinds of courses that talk about customer funding. And of course, ideally, we'll get the students to read my book so they really understand it. But one of the things I've done to help all the educators in our community is put chapter 1 of the book on my London Business School faculty page for free to download. So anybody on this call and any of your students can download chapter 1, and that's going to give you an overview of what these principles are and how they work. I think this just has to find its way into our curricula.
Absolutely.
It's a mistrick if we don't.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, John. This has to find in our curriculum. And by the way, thank you for sharing your first chapter. When John mentioned first chapter, I'm telling you, it's 60 pages, and it has that resource really gives us a really good idea of what John was talking about. And this is what I noticed in John's books and also my interaction with him. He's very generous. So he has been generous in sharing that 60 pages of all the essence of his book. But with the other follow-up of that, there's good information after that. But 60 pages really give you a good view. So I'm going to share that resource over the chat function in 2 minutes, in a little bit. But before that, I want to kind of follow up a question that that has been mentioned in the chat. One comment and one question. So one comment that's mentioned in addition to what you have just talked about, John, is by our colleague that mentioned, Mujtaba Asham, mentioned that customer funding may not work for products with long product development timelines or a lot of start in the front funding, which is biopharmaceutical, right? But apart from that, you know, I can see that you're nodding. Apart from that, it applies in a lot of others, consumer electronics or, you know, website and different things, right?
Well, let me add some perspective to that. So I don't argue that every single business could be customer funded. So for example, India has a compelling need for more water. Well, you probably couldn't build a dam and a hydroelectric power plant on a fast moving river in India and sell the power before you built the dam and the power plant. So I understand you can't do this for everyone, but one of the limitations and the reasons why some entrepreneurs think they can't use these models is because they say, well, I have to hire people to build a website, or I have to hire people to do this or that. Well, in my view, what that is an admission that they don't have the right entrepreneurial team in place. If you've got the right team in place that can actually do the things that have to be done or built or whatever at the beginning to get to a good enough prototype that you can sell, then you don't have a complete team. So if you get the team in place, the team can work on this stuff. Maybe they have to get money from a day job. Maybe they have to do some consulting assignments. But with the right team, most of the time, not all the time, fair enough, but most of the time, you can get enough stuff done that you then have something that a customer is willing to write you a check for.
Great, great. Excellent, John. So let's move on to this really topic that's coming up in chat. So right now with the lean startup model, that's kind of overtaking the world. So we talk about starting up lean, right? And testing and experimenting, right? So this is a question from Adain Maloui. So lean startup versus traditional approach. Is lean startup the new normal, right? Especially in this context. How do your view, which is the customer funded business, how does this kind of correspond with the world view that lean startup is promoting to us?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think these are two parallel paths. So in the lean startup, the basic idea is you have some hypotheses that you want to test, and some of those hypotheses are around the customer needs and whether they're going to buy. Well, that's the same thing that a customer-funded entrepreneur wants to do. He's got a hypothesis of what's going to work, and he goes to a customer and he asks the customer to pay. So this is just adding, if you will, an economic development, sort of an economic, track to the lean startup process, and it's exactly what Steve Blank would do anyway. Steve's the godfather, as we all know, of the lean startup process, and Steve would be the first to say that if you've got something that's really solving a compelling customer problem, you should be asking the customer to pay for it.
Absolutely. So which our audience also agrees, lean startup is a philosophy. We need to build this culture, and this takes some time, but also this is one of the steps that you can do, put that philosophy in action, in practice, right?
Exactly.
John, here I have a question that's from our Q&A session, and I have been hoarding this question. It's a really good question that is being asked by Amir Nasori. This kind of goes back to the 5 model, to the gist of the things that he mentioned, that out of the 5, I believe, pay in advance is the best. You put it in the first as well. Do you have any challenge in applying this? And one of the things that we have audience from Africa, we have audience from India, and I have seen their questions, and they really want to see whether you have any examples that can apply in their context in Africa or India, applying.
Yeah, I do. There's a great story that's in the book about a company in India called Via.
Mm-hmm.
Today, Via is the Intel inside of the travel industry in India. But when Via started, the entrepreneur had an idea that travel agents, which at the time did not offer real-time access to ticketing. So if you wanted to fly from Bangalore to Delhi, for example, next Wednesday, you'd go to your local travel agent in your village in India, and you'd say, that's what I want to do. And they'd say, okay, come back tomorrow and I'll tell you what it's going to cost and when you can go, because there was no real-time access.
Mm-hmm.
This is back in 2006. And so what this entrepreneur did is he said, you know, if I could give the travel agents real-time access, they would be vastly more attractive to customers than the traditional travel agents who don't have that. So he went to travel agents and said, here's the deal. You give me a $5,000 deposit. I will give you a laptop. I will give you access to the global distribution system that enables you to have real-time ticketing. And you'll just top up your $5,000 deposit as you issue tickets. So there's always $5,000 there against which you can issue tickets. You never have to tell the customer to wait. There's no issues about credit. Long story short, he got 160 travel agents to sign up for that proposition on day one. Mm-hmm. Well, not day one, but you know, in a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. If we do the math, 5,000 times 160, that's $800,000 that he had in the bank with which to fund the start of the business. Mm-hmm. Well, today that business does over $500 million in revenue just from its little tiny slice of the ticketing that goes through its portal. Mm-hmm. So there's a great example in India of exactly how you can do this.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And John, what I like is your example is very international because you are originally American and teaches in UK, and UK is, you know, as we know, is very international place. Your example in your book is from everywhere in the world. I really enjoy, as a non-native American, I really enjoy that. So our audience from the world can see a little bit from them in there. And I want to say that this customer-founded model, in my opinion, it's applies everywhere in the world, right? With modifications. So it's a really
well, and it's especially useful in poorer parts of the world where basically there isn't any venture capital, or there's so little of it that it's practically impossible to get your hands on. Mm-hmm. So entrepreneurs there have to use these models. Mm-hmm. And as we know, in Africa and in India and other parts of the world that are similar, there are incredible problems that entrepreneurs can solve, social problems, economic problems. And if you can figure out a way to solve those problems by getting the customer, even though it's a poor customer, mm-hmm. to give you a little bit of money up front to solve their problem, they're going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. And that also answers the question that's coming up in the chat function that's about, whether the customer-funded model works better in poor or rich countries. Is there any relevance? So is there anything you want to add to that question?
Yeah, it works in both places. But the key to it, to making it work, is you've got to be solving a genuine problem for the customer. I mean, that's what entrepreneurs do so well, right? We identify problems, and then we come up with solutions that can actually solve those problems. If you're solving a customer problem, the customer will pay.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. So I just want to do a little time check. So we are 10 minutes to go for this session. And there's a lot of resources being shared in the chat function, including John's LBS link, where you can download chapter of this book and also chapter of his 2 other books. So the teaser of the 2 other books. So those function, or if you cannot find that link, Google John Mullins London Business School. That will take you to John's website, right? So I have 10 minutes go when we are going to our last stretch here and to wrapping up. But I want to let you know that if you have other sessions that you want to go, before this, you can log off and then go to other sessions. But John will stay here for 5 minutes or so after 8:50, if you have any extra questions, right?
Happy to do that. Happy to do that.
Thank you, John. So let's kind of going back a little bit in terms of more of a kind of jumping a little bit away from this this book per se, but also in terms of kind of where does this book fit into your evolution of your thought, specifically in terms of this, your first two books. How does this book, you know, can you tell us a little bit about your two other books and how does this kind of fit a little bit over there?
So the first book, The New Business Road Test, came about because in 2000, at the time of the dot-com bust, students were coming up with all kinds of goofy internet ideas, right? Some of you were teaching at that time and you remember those days. And I said to myself, the last thing I want to do is send talented LBS students out into the world of entrepreneurship and have them fail quickly. Wouldn't it be better if we could send them out with at least ideas that have a fighting chance to win? Mm-hmm. So there needed to be a way to have something in the literature to help people objectively and on an evidence-based manner assess the opportunity before they get started down the road, mm-hmm. Whether it's a lean startup or not. Mm-hmm. And so that was the first book. But then, you know, as I began working with more and more entrepreneurs, I realized this phenomenon about plan A and plan B, and that plan A almost never works, and that it's always plan B, or for PayPal, it was plan G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It was the seventh idea for Max Levchin's encryption technology that actually became what we know as PayPal today. Mm-hmm. So that led me to say, well, gee, we got to find a process to get from plan A to plan B. It's not like you have plan A in your front pocket and plan B in your back pocket. Mm-hmm. And I met Randy Commissar, and Randy had been thinking about the same issue. He's a venture capitalist with Kleiner Perkins. And I met Randy, and he'd been thinking about that. And both of us had been thinking about the phrase business model, which back then was in about every other sentence any entrepreneur would ever utter. Mm-hmm. You know, we were all talking about business models, but we didn't think anybody knew what they were talking about when they used those words. What did they mean by that? So we wrote Getting to Plan B in order to develop a way to think conceptually about whether the economics are going to work without building a spreadsheet in Excel with a whole bunch of unfounded assumptions. And at the same time provide a process that can get you from the plan A you start with, testing hypotheses, kind of the lean startup approach. It's very parallel to what the lean startup guys are saying. Test hypotheses, figure out what your leaps of faith are that you're not sure are true or not, and you're going to have to examine those with evidence, you know, and then you make progress, and then maybe you pivot. Well, in the course of writing that book, we told the story of Costco. Those of you from around the world won't all know Costco, but it's a very large general merchandise and food retailer based in the US, but they do businesses in Ireland and the UK and some other places as well. Costco is unusual in that you have to pay to shop in the store. Can you imagine that? So as an American, I think I pay $60 a year to have a membership to Costco, and that gives me the right to shop in the store. Mm-hmm. Well, what we discovered is the membership fees that get paid to Costco constitute 2/3 of operating earnings every single year. So they can basically run the retailing business on almost break even. Mm-hmm. And Target, Kmart's now gone, but you know, Marks and Spencer in the UK, nobody can compete with that because Costco's getting all this money up front. Mm-hmm. And that was the first glimmer of light that led to this idea of customer funding. Well, gee, if Costco's doing that, funding the business with its customers' deposits up front, are there other ways to do that? And that, of course, led to the customer funding business.